guys, I'm Erin and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video that is a wrap-up for the 2020 Our Fantasy Bingo Board. So if you're unaware of what this is, I will link the Reddit post below that goes into the full detailed explanation, but in brief, this is a year-long challenge hosted by the Fantasy subreddit that goes from April 1st to March 31st of the following year, and you have a 5x5 bingo card with 25 different prompts, and every year they change up the prompts and you read books that fit those prompts. Pretty simple, and I thought it was really fun. This was the first year I have done it, and so I'm going to be doing some stats at the beginning of just the reading I did for this, and then briefly go over what I read for each prompt, not really going into depth on any of them because I don't want this video to be forever long, and then I'll do some final thoughts on prompts I thought were hard, that I liked, favorite book I read, etc. And so getting right into it, we're starting off with just a couple prompts. So as I said, this was it's a 25 prompt challenge, so I read 25 books for it. And of those books, 17 were adult books and 8 were young adult. I had an average rating of a 3.88 from these books, so my average rating for this challenge is pretty in line with just my general average rating for reading. So this wasn't filled with new favorites, but it wasn't filled with stinkers either. So part of the reason for this challenge is encouraging people to pick up new things they might not have picked up before. One of the rules is you can't repeat authors, so this was also 25 different authors. So in the spirit of wanting to pick up new things, I also looked at how many of these authors I had never read before, and so of these 25, 15 were new to me authors, and of those 15, 6 I have read since. 4 of them I have not read a second book from, but I do own copies of more books by them that are on my physical TBR, so they will be read. And so I think that's really good. It introduced me to several authors that I'm really glad I picked up, and my favorite book that I read for this challenge was from a new to me author. So I thought that was a really good result of this bingo, and definitely I think a good reason to try it out. Okay, so here is an empty bingo card just to see the prompts, and then here is a picture of my completed bingo card with all of the book covers. And so I will go through, just briefly mention what I read for each one, and maybe like one thought on each. Starting with the first square in the top. For translated fiction, I read The Last Wish by Koepkowski and translated by Danusia Stock, and this was translated from Polish, and it was the first in the Witcher series. It was the first collection of short stories, and I enjoyed it. I haven't quite decided if I want to dive into the full series yet, but this was one of my new to me authors. The next square was the setting of Snow, Ice, or Cold, and so for that I read a young adult novel, The Crown's Game by Evelyn Skye. This was also a new to me author. I enjoyed this one. It was set in kind of a fantasy Russia, so cold, and I thought it should have been a standalone, but there is a sequel, and I just don't have any interest in picking up, but this one I thought was fun. Next, for optimistic fiction, was another new to me author, and I read Warriors of the Wild by Trisha Levenseller. This was just fun. Both books I read by her now have just been fun reads. Next up, for the necromancy square, I read Scent of Magic by Maria V. Snyder. This was the second book in her Healer trilogy, the second book in the Healer trilogy, and I thought it was good, but I was disappointed based on how much I loved the first one, but still, not a bad read. For Ace Arrow, I read All Systems Red by Martha Wells, which is the first Murderbot novella, and I thought it was good, but I didn't love the rest of the novellas as much, but the first one wasn't bad. For the Ghost Square, I read Shadows of the Fox by Julia Kagawa. This is the first book in a young adult fantasy trilogy, and this was a trilogy that I, unpopular opinion, think peaked with the first book, which I did quite enjoy, just wasn't as good with the second two. For exploration, I read another new to me author, which was The Bone Chips by R.J. Barker, and I have mentioned this in other videos, I freaking love this book. So good. For climate fiction, I read The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin, which was the last book in the Broken Earth trilogy, and unfortunately, I just didn't like it as much as the other two. It was still pretty solid on the grand scheme of comparing it to other books, but within those three, this was definitely the weakest in my opinion. For color in the title, I read The Black Tides of Heaven by Neon Yang. This is the first novella in the Tenserite novella series, which is a really underhyped fantasy novella series, and I think more people should read it because I think those are very good. For the Our Fantasy Book Club square, I read The Blue Sword by Robin McKinley, which I thought was fine. I didn't love it. It does not make me want to pick up more Robin McKinley books, but it was okay. For self-published, I read Unenchanted by Chanda Han. This is a young adult fantasy that I've had sitting on my Nook for literal years and hadn't picked up, and it was okay. It was I enjoyed reading it, but it did not leave me wanting to read the rest of the series. It was kind of just good while it was happening, and then it was done, and I've kind of forgotten most of what happened, and it wasn't a book that stuck around with you. For chapter epigraphs, I read, I think, the only sci-fi on my entire bingo board, which is A Memory Called Empire by Arcady Martine. This was another new to me author that I really quite enjoyed. Very excited to read the sequel, which is sitting right behind me, and I haven't picked it up yet. I think this is definitely made me realize that political sci-fi is the subgenre of sci-fi I think I like the most, and has pushed me to start looking into that subgenre more, to check out more sci-fi. For published in 2020, I read All the Stars and Teeth by Adeline Grace, which is a new to me author and a young adult fantasy that was, it was really fun. It has its flaws, but this is just one of those books I just had a really good time reading it. And I'm also excited to read the sequel, which is also sitting right behind me. For School or University, I read The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, which I thought was just fine. I didn't really like it that much. It felt like a fever dream. I loved The Night Circus when I read it years ago when it first came out, and this one just felt like a letdown, and I'm wondering if I would hate The Night Circus now if I read it now. If it's just because of my change in taste. So, for books about books, I read The Well of Lost Plots by Jasper Fforde. This is one of the Thursday Next books, which I think is a really great, fun, kind of light-hearted adventure fantasy series. Definitely recommend. For Made You Laugh, I read Crosstalk by Connie Willis, which is kind of a contemporary romance split with the science fiction, and it was not amazing, but it was certainly interesting. And I didn't love it, but I am glad I gave it a shot. It's definitely something different. For short stories, it only asks for 5 short stories, but I read an entire anthology, and then for my bingo card I listed the 5 stories from that anthology that were my favorite. And so the anthology I read was The Book of Dragons, edited by Jonathan Strahan, and then the 5 short stories I enjoyed the most from this anthology were A Whisper of Blue by Ken Liu, Horde by Shauna McGuire, We Don't Talk About the Dragon by Sarah Gailey, Habitat by KJ Parker, and Pox by Ellen Klages. And all 5 of those were new to me authors, and I have since picked up more Sarah Gailey books and have been enjoying them. For Big Dumb Object Square, I read Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh, which was a really fun, short, just kind of atmospheric, woodsy, cute little story. And I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking to picking up the sequel sometime soon, hopefully. For The Feminist Square, I read Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri. As I mentioned in a previous video, this is one of my favorite completed series, this duology with its sequel. I really quite enjoyed it. I'm very interested in everything Tasha Suri picks up, so glad I picked this up last year. For Canadian author, I read Traitor's Blade by Sebastian de Castell. Again, this is another series that I then completed after reading the first one for this challenge, and really loved, and it's one of my favorite completed series of all time for fantasy. I'm very excited for his new release this year. For a number in the title, I read Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, which I also really liked. We're hitting a string of great ones right now. This book was really fun. I love heist stories. I really quite enjoyed this duology. For romance, I read Vision and Silver by Anne Bishop, which is one of the Others novels, which is a series I have thoughts on. It's one of those series that started off as kind of a fun popcorn read. Like, I read it the way I enjoy watching The Bachelor, where I don't think it's actually well done, but I enjoy it anyways, and then it really tanked at book 3. And it brought it back up a little bit. So I have a lot of mixed feelings on this series, but so that's what I read for the romance square. For Magical Pet, I read Dawnshire by Brandon Sanderson. This is a Stormlight Archive novella that takes place in between books 3 and 4, and it's definitely the better of the 2 Stormlight novellas, in my opinion. For graphic/audio novel, I did an audiobook, which was Heartless by Marissa Meyer, and I did not like this. I previously read the Cinder series by Marissa Meyer, and I really liked that series by her, and this one really just didn't hit for me. It captured the essence of Wonderland really well, because this was an Alice in Wonderland retelling about the Red Queen, but I just wasn't into the plot at all, so not a fan of this one. And lastly, for the Politics Square, I read The Rose and the Dagger by Renee Ahdieh, which is the second in a duology, young adult fantasy duology that is a retelling of 1001 Nights, and I really quite enjoyed this duology. It was really fun, and I think a really good retelling of. So those were the 25 books I read, and so kind of just some final thoughts on those. So my favorite read from these 25 was definitely The Bone Ships by R.J. Barker. I freaking love that book. I haven't picked up the sequel yet, and I'm hoping to do that this month. It's on my TBR for this month, and I'm very excited about it. I really loved it, and I really want to check out more of what he's written. So my strategy for this card was just kind of to freewheel it for like the first 6 or 7 months, because volume-wise, I definitely read enough books that I don't have to like stringently plan, or I wouldn't make it. Like it's not like I only read 25 books in a year, so if I didn't read ones that fit the categories, I literally wouldn't finish. I definitely read enough books volume-wise that I was not concerned about having to plan it all out in April for the whole year. So I decided to take the first about 6 months and just kind of freewheel it and just read what I would have normally read and just see what categories I could fill up with that, and then pick out books for the categories I hadn't really just naturally come across yet. And so a couple books that I ended up picking up either entirely because of the challenge, or ones I had kind of were on my radar but I was kind of pushed to pick up earlier, or ones I had owned on my nook for a long time and hadn't picked up and finally picked up because of this challenge, included Unenchanted by Chanda Han. Again, that was one I had on my nook forever and just never picked up, and then when I saw it filled the self-published square, which is not something I read a lot of. I just don't generally pick up self-published fantasies. I picked this one up. The Book of Dragons is one I probably would not have picked up without this challenge, because I don't generally read short stories, and so when I saw this one on like an upcoming fantasy releases list, I was like, ooh, stories about dragons, that's something that sounds cool, and hey, I need a short story collection for this challenge, so that one I probably wouldn't have picked up, and I'm very glad I did. As well as Silver in the Wood, that was one that I had gotten as a freebie from Tor's free ebook club last year, and it was kind of sitting on my nook again. I don't gravitate towards novellas as much, and it sounded good, but I just never felt compelled to pick it up. But when I realized this was the last one I read this month, and so when it hit that last category and this one fit for it, I was like, perfect, we can get that one in and finish this card on time. And so I'm definitely glad I picked that one up. But other than that, pretty much everything else was something I kind of just read naturally. I definitely had some of the categories in mind when I like ended up reading them, but none of the other ones really felt like something that I picked up because of the challenge. Like, some of them were ones I kind of bought on a whim, and then when I picked it up, I was like, oh great, it fits the challenge. But I think those 3 were the only ones that I truly felt like I picked up just because of the challenge. I did end up reading, again, part of this challenge is to help you read more different things, and so I did end up discovering a lot of new authors, but as far as books I wouldn't have read otherwise, I didn't actually pick up any new books. So I guess in that way, the challenge of getting you to read, or getting me to read more different books than I normally would, kind of failed, because I did discover a lot of new authors, but again, a lot of them were ones I probably would have picked up anyways. And so I think maybe next year I'll try to do the hard mode version of this bingo, which is just a more specific version of each challenge, and maybe that will result in me pushing myself to end up picking up books I wouldn't have otherwise, because all the challenges are like slightly more narrow and won't be as easy just to fit in what I just read normally. But either way, I mean, I still had a good time. The only person I'm challenging here is myself, so one last thing I wanted to kind of talk about was what I thought the hardest categories were. The hardest category was easily the Big Dumb Object category, primarily because I'd never heard of that before. I believe it's primarily a sci-fi term, and I have not read a ton of sci-fi, and so I just had not really encountered that idea in books that much to start with, and I had never heard that term ever anyway, so that one was definitely the hardest, just as far as coming up with things on my own. And then on the fantasy subreddit, they frequently have recommendation threads for the different bingo cards, so people can recommend books they've read that fit them. And when looking for recommendations for that one, it was definitely the one that I had the hardest time picking out things in the recommendations that I wanted to read. And so the other book I had on deck for this slot was the first Expanse book, which it was kind of between those two, and I just ended up picking up Silver in the Wood first. And so that one was definitely the hardest. So the graphic audio one was also harder, just because I don't listen to a ton of audiobooks, and when I do listen to an audiobook, it's essentially never fantasy. Usually it's contemporary, or sometimes historical. I just don't prefer consuming the kind of heavier world building and magic and all that extra new things you get in fantasy books through audio, where it's like with the contemporary, it's a lot lighter and fluffier kind of story, and it's just easier for me to do on audio. It was hard just because sometimes it's hard to know from like a summary on the back of a book if it's gonna have a magical bed, and I just never encountered it. I read Dawn Shard in January, and so it took forever for me to just naturally encounter one, whereas a lot of these were either easier to just naturally encounter or easier to tell from the backs of books whether they're going to have that prompt in it or not. So those are the ones I found harder. I'm definitely interested in what the new card is going to be when they drop the new prompts in April, and I will be making another video, some kind of TBR for the new one, reaction. Haven't decided exactly because, as I said, I didn't really set a TBR for this one, especially when it was first announced. That was like months later. I like kind of set a TBR for the remaining squares, so I don't know if I'll do a TBR video or just kind of a general reaction video. We'll see. So thanks for watching this video, and if you participated in our fantasy bingo, let me know below what your favorite book you read for it was, or what category you found the hardest to fill. And I'll see you in my next video.